Welcome to our Asia Society Town Hall on anti-Asian violence, racial justice, and police reform. This is a critical topic that we're very much looking forward to diving into today. Joining us are speakers with diverse points of view on police reform. We'll talk about how community groups can come together, and we'll also review hate crime legislation that has been signed into law. Our moderator is Eugene Robinson, Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist for the Washington Post. Asia Society has launched a global task force on countering racism against Asians. This initiative is led by our CEO, Kevin Rudd, and we've called it Asian Americans Building America. Staff from across departments of our global organization meet every week, and we talk about what we can do to help move the needle. That's how the idea for this program was developed. This event is hosted by our Asia Society headquarters in New York and our Northern California Center. Our format for this program: first, we'll hear a very special message from California Attorney General Rob Bonta. Then I'll introduce our moderator, Gene. He'll introduce our three speakers, and they'll have a moderated discussion. And then the room will be open for audience Q&A. Now, we do want to hear from you. If you have questions for any of our speakers, please type them in the Q&A box. Gene, our moderator, will be monitoring them throughout the program. And again, we do encourage all points of view here at Asia Society. Welcome to our audience from across our 13 global centers, including our trustees, board members, groundbreaker members, and innovator members. For our VIPs, if you received an email to join our VIP reception, click over to that second Zoom link right after this program. We're going to continue the conversation with our speakers. We have an hour for this public portion of the program. We'll end at 6 p.m. Pacific, 9 p.m. Eastern. This event is on the record, and we are recording. To kick us off, let's now hear a special message from California Attorney General Rob Bonta. He is the first Filipino and second Asian American to hold his position. Let's please play the clip.
Good evening, Asia Society. I'm Rob Bonta, California Attorney General. I wish I was able to join you live, but I appreciate this opportunity to join Larry, Eugene, Shaun, and Lavita, and all of our speakers and guests tonight to kick off a very important conversation. 18 months into this pandemic, our nation stands at the crossroad of anti-Asian violence, racial injustice, and police reform. How do we move forward? Our communities are hurting. A surge of anti-Asian violence leaves the AAPI community feeling vulnerable and afraid. For many of us, everyday life now comes with an added worry. Going to the grocery store, riding a bus, picking our kids up from school. In these moments, many of us ask ourselves, could I be next? My own mother recently asked me if she thought it was safe to take a ride into the city by herself. And I had to tell her, you know, Mom, I think I'd like to take you. In response to anti-Asian attacks and violence, some urge for an increased law enforcement response, while some activists and community leaders aren't sure more policing is the answer. How do we reconcile these differences and move forward? How do we ensure our communities are kept safe? I hope tonight's conversation helps us better understand answers to these questions. From my perspective, I believe the path forward starts with trust. We must work together to rebuild trust between law enforcement and our communities. It's a paramount issue of justice. I have yet to meet a single Californian who does not want to be protected from crime, hate, and violence. But nor is there a single Californian who wants to fall victim to an unjust application of force or violence from law enforcement either. Right now, all across America, from the AAPI community, Black community, and beyond, we're dealing with a reckoning on these issues because too many Americans don't trust that they can get one without the other. That's wrong, has always been wrong, and it needs to change. And we've heard those calls for change. There has been a crisis of trust in our law enforcement, and we need more and better mechanisms for accountability and transparency. I believe we can restore public trust and keep our communities and officers safe. This work is not mutually exclusive. In fact, it's reinforcing. Trust generates safety. Safety generates trust. Under my watch, the California Department of Justice has implemented Assembly Bill 1506, a bill I co-authored when I was in the California Assembly, to ensure impartial, fair investigations and independent reviews of officer-involved shootings, to build trust and protect communities. I accelerated the release of third-party peace officer use of force and misconduct records to build trust and protect communities. I established the new Racial Justice Bureau to help tackle the rise of hate, to build trust and protect communities. I issued new guidance and resources to help the public and law enforcement better understand and address hate crimes in California, to build trust and protect communities. I launched the Office of Community Awareness, Response, and Engagement to directly engage with and respond to the needs of communities, to build trust and protect communities. These actions and others are part of my broad effort to repair trust and advance justice for all Californians. For those who are hurting, trust will not come back overnight, but we cannot afford to be complacent. In our path forward, we must continue to actively listen and engage the community and stay on task in our shared mission to ensure public safety and equal protection for every family. Right now, we are in a state of emergency and a state of crisis when it comes to AAPI hate. But during these difficult moments, we've shown resilience. We've listened to each other. We've supported each other. We've lifted each other up. Let's keep doing that today. Let's build trust. As California Attorney General, I'm committed to that. I'm committed to ensuring every community is seen, valued, and protected. I hope you enjoyed tonight's town hall, and I'm looking forward to joining you in person soon. Thank you to Asia Society New York and Asia Society Northern California for hosting this important conversation, and to all the staff, guests, and sponsors for making this event possible. Thank you.
And our thanks to Attorney General Bonta for his thoughtful commentary and support. And now a few words about our moderator, Eugene Robinson, who is joining us from Arlington, Virginia. He writes a column on politics and culture twice a week and hosts a weekly online chat with readers. He is an author and has been with the Washington Post for 3 decades, including being posted in Buenos Aires and London. In 2009, he received a Pulitzer Prize for commentary. We are so pleased to have you with us, Gene. Thank you very much for moderating. It is all yours.
Thank you so much, Margaret, and thank you so much to the Asia Society for inviting me here tonight to moderate what I think is a really important discussion. I will add two biographical notes before we begin. First, I'm afraid my career at the Washington Post has been closer to 4 decades than it has been 3 decades. But before I came to the Post, my first job out of college was working as a reporter, a cub reporter at the San Francisco Chronicle. And one of the things I remember vividly from that experience when I covered police especially was the somewhat callous and ignorant way in which the police of the late 1970s dealt with the Asian American community, particularly the Chinese American community in San Francisco. I know things must have improved since then because they couldn't have gotten much worse in terms of police attitudes toward the community. But that's a background, sort of a touchstone of where we're coming from. We've come some distance, but I have a feeling we've got a long way to go. We have a great panel here tonight, and I want to introduce our panelists. First, we have Lavita Tuff, who is the Policy Director for Asian Americans Advancing Justice Atlanta, which is the first and only nonprofit legal advocacy organization in Georgia and the Southeast, committed to protecting the civil and human rights of Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders. And she is a native of Atlanta, Georgia. We have Larry Yee, who is a San Francisco police commissioner, presiding president of the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association, and president of Hop Wo Benevolent Association. Larry spent 40 years in the telecommunications industry, starting with AT&T before retiring in 2018. And for almost 2.5 decades, he's devoted himself to serving San Francisco, particularly the Chinatown community that he grew up in. And finally, Shaun Lin, who is pursuing a PhD in geography at the CUNY Graduate Center, where his research and interests include immigrant communities, food and foodways, and abolition geography. He's an adjunct lecturer in urban studies at Queens College, and a longtime resident of Sunset Park, Brooklyn, where he organizes with Sunset Park for a liberated future Sunset Park Popular Assembly, and No New Jails NYC against gentrification, displacement, policing, and prisons. So we have, this is just an hour for this program, and we have a really big topic. I'm going to start with Larry. Larry, as a San Francisco police commissioner, you're in a position to tell us exactly what's been going on, what you have observed with anti-Asian violence in one of the most important heavily Asian American communities in the country. What have you been seeing, and how has that evolved over time?
Thank you, Eugene Robinson. Great to see you, and great to talk about it. I grew up in San Francisco, Chinatown. I've seen it from the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and then we're into the 2020. And during the 2020, when the president of Trump started using the language of the Kung Fu virus and China virus, that's when we saw the finger pointing that came out that the Chinese are the problem here. And we saw a rash of violence that happened, I guess, with people being, had to stay home. And once they got out, every so often, the rage came out, and it was just that we were the scapegoat of all these problems that the president has faced. I seen it earlier before. It's not that it just happened. It's been probably over 100 years, whether it's Chinese, the blacks, the Hispanics, the Arabs. It does come out once the leadership in this United States start calling them out. So we need to end this hate, and it needs to start from the top. And we need to build back where we can be transparency, and also that we have fairness and respect for all. So I thank the mayor for appointing me, and also working with the police chief, William Scott. I feel that we have moved in the right direction. That's where we started placing more beat officers in Chinatown and getting the feedback from the community and what needs to be done. And I just want to say, I know there's a lot of fear in my community, and it's real. And if they come out in force, it's always strength in number. That's what I feel. If we all come out, we're stronger and we'll be safer.
Mm-hmm. Larry, have you seen any, we've had a change of administration. I mean, you talked about leadership, you talked about President Trump calling it the, Kung flu and that sort of thing, in a way, perhaps giving permission to some people to act out anti-Asian violence. Have you seen any evolution in the incidents of anti-Asian violence since we had a change of administration and the Biden administration came in?
I would say yes. I see that with it being toned down, well, it's not going to stop right away. But what's happened is we have put some resource out there to address these issues. And then where the seniors feel that they're safer involved, we have what you call the community outreach to them. That's the self-help that will walk a senior to the bank or to shopping down in Tenderloin. If you know Tenderloin, it's a haven for homelessness, and it's prolific. It's because of this COVID, it just got compact down there, and it's very difficult for many of the residents. And the Tenderloins is the housing for many of these new immigrants with families and kids. So there's the mayor has put resources out there too as well. It's not just in Chinatown, it's in the Tenderloin and wherever we need it in the Bay View. I'm very happy to say that we're trying as best as we can, but you're not going to stop every crime and every hate. But we can educate them, and hopefully we will get over this soon rather than later.
One of the contexts for this discussion is that the Asian American population has been growing rapidly. And
right.
Asian Americans as a political force have been gaining strength. The Asian American share of the vote took quite a jump in 2020. I know just from being here in Washington that people who do politics for a living are all of a sudden paying more attention to the Asian American vote than they ever did. I want to turn to Lavita because particularly in a place like Atlanta and in the Southeast, the idea of Asian Americans being an important demographic and political force is very new. Yet Atlanta is a place where there was a horrific act of anti-Asian violence earlier this year. Those spree killings at the spas at the end of March that claimed 8 lives. And Lavita, I wish could you talk about that and also your work in Atlanta in the context of the city having lived through this awful incident.
Absolutely. So the work that we've been doing at Asian Americans Advancing Justice Atlanta has been going on for over a decade. We were founded in 2010. And so all of our work takes on a community-centered approach. And so the devastating events that took place in March definitely had a huge impact on the AAPI community here in Georgia. And what our organization did was we took a role in making sure that we were assessing the situation and coordinating with partners across races, across the state, so that we can come together in solidarity to figure out how we could help our communities heal as one. And we did that. And then we decided what would be the appropriate response that the community wanted to see, and also the victims and their families. And we gave them support financially, as well as mental health services and additional items that they needed. And so we continue to support the families and support the notion that AAPI community in Georgia is a growing demographic. We do recognize after the 2020 election that more than 2,000 AAPI Georgians voted in the 2020 election, and that was more than a 60% increase from 2016. We know that in the 2020 election that 3 out of 10 AAPI Georgians who voted were first-time voters. And so our organization has been doing a lot of groundwork over the last 10 years to make sure that we were pushing out AAPI voters and engaging them honestly in a way that political candidates were not. And as we continue to embark on this journey of, trying to have a greater Georgia, a better Georgia for all, we recognize that the noise has died down some for some of those elected officials, right? And so we had their support when it was an election, we had their support when it was tragedy, and yet it hasn't really translated into ongoing support year round in terms of language justice, in terms of additional services that the AAPI community in Georgia really needs.
Well, just one quick question. I mean, how are the families doing in the wake of those terrible shootings?
Absolutely. So I don't want to, speak on their behalf, but what I will say is that they are greatly supported by our organization and other community organizations, not just in Georgia, but around the country. And they are continuing to receive our ongoing support in any capacity that they will permit us to give it.
Let me turn to Shaun, because one of the topics of the discussion this evening is police reform. And I want to understand how you see police reform in this context. I remember, Shaun, as I said in my introduction, 40 years ago, the way police dealt with, for example, Chinatown in San Francisco, which was from a position of ignorance. It was philosophy was entirely carceral. It was, lock them up. There was very little understanding of the community, and some hostility between the community and police. I have a sense that there's less of that nationwide than there was then, but I'm not really sure. And I'm wondering how you see police reform in this context.
Thank you, Eugene. My name is Shaun, and I grew up in California. I was born and raised in Los Angeles. I lived in Los Angeles during the LA rebellion in '92, and very much remember, these kind of familiar tropes of Black communities and Asian communities being pit against each other in these moments of crisis. Um, I guess the first thing, the prompt was talking about anti-Asian violence, and I want to acknowledge the pain and the fear that exists. I know my mom is on this call tonight. Hi, Mom. I love you very much. And, in thinking about, the rise in discourse around anti-Asian violence, I really want to kind of put this into some historical perspective. So this rise of anti-Asian violence comes in the context of a long history of anti-Asian violence, right? And this goes back to the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act and the specific targeting of Chinese communities, specifically in rural places, with violence, with lynchings that kind of push people into Chinatowns in that time. And, going into the internment of Japanese Americans who were forced into concentration camps at the beginning of World War II, through US military violence in Southeast Asia and Vietnam, and in Korea, and then Islamophobia and, anti-Muslim violence that happened in the post September 11 years under President George Bush. So, anti-Asian violence is nothing new. And I feel that these rises of violence often kind of symbolize people's fears and insecurities, specifically, white working class fears and insecurities. I think the other thing that I want to talk about, so you asked me about policing, right? And I am someone who doesn't think that there is a role for police in addressing this issue, and I talked about this long history of anti-Asian violence. This falls into a longer history of racist violence in the United States. And I think I want to be intentional about talking about anti-Asian violence in the context of violence that impacts other marginalized communities as well. And, in this long history, I can't think of a single example in which police have been a solution to these problems. Oftentimes, actually, police are the state-sanctioned violence in these communities, right? And if I were to, ask you all on the panel or folks in the audience to just close your eyes and imagine what a safe community looks like, I doubt that very many people would imagine a community that had a lot of police standing on every corner, like a lot of these neighborhoods that we work in here in New York, where police are an occupying force in a lot of communities of color, and specifically Black communities. So, I don't believe that the police are part of the solution. And, I think that we're going to be talking a little bit about specific reforms later on, so I'll hold my comments until then. But the last thing that I want to say is that, I'm speaking from the perspective of someone who believes in prison abolition, right? And just to be clear, I'm gonna quote my mentor, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who talks about prison abolition being about abolishing the conditions under which prisons became the solutions to the problems, rather than abolishing the buildings which we call prisons. So in thinking about this spate of anti-Asian violence, what are the conditions that are causing this rise of violence, right? This is racial white supremacist violence. With the example in Atlanta, this is also gender-based violence, patriarchal violence. And then what are the, what would limit the capacity of people to carry out this type of violence, right? So how do we limit the ability for someone who carries a lot of hate to be able to kill a lot of people very quickly? Right. So how do we think through the actual conditions and how do we limit the capacities? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. No, okay. I mean, that's fascinating. And, I've always, I can't remember who said it first. I wish I could take credit for it, but whoever said that policing is something that has to be done with a community. It's not something that's done to a community, and that American policing in general has certainly evolved into, and maybe has always been in terms of communities of color, something done to those communities, almost in opposition to the people that are supposed to be protected. But fortunately, we have a police commissioner here who can speak to the role today, given so Larry, given the history of policing in Chinatown, for example, where you grew up, you are the only one other than me on the call to remember what I think of as the really bad old days in terms of that relationship. But talk a bit about how policing in the Asian American community in San Francisco and in general has evolved.
I'll just say in San Francisco, Chinatown, and in general, the San Francisco Police Department, they are changing. In 2015, there was a shooting. It shook up the mayor and the board of supervisors, and they demanded that there be reform. And the Department of Justice came in through the Obama tenure that they took a look at it from the top all the way down bottom, and what was needed and what needs to be addressed by the city. It's disparity is one, racial bias implicit, right? Reflection of the policing that needs to reflect the community. And I guess those are some of the steps that should have been done, I guess, before then, but still we're now on that trend. In regards to the local policing, you may say we don't need it. When you have shop owners being vandalized, outright vandalized, where do you get the policing and the protection from these perpetrators, right? You may say it's just a social injustice, but in the meantime, our shop owners, our merchants, our residents come underneath attack. Some of the people are, I guess, need some mental health, and we're on that track right now. We have what you call a community liaison unit, where we address that's from the mayor's office to address that you be policing from the community, and those are the homeless people that those organizations can't handle. It's called SCRIP. It's Street Crisis Response Team. It's taken away from the policing, because once you bring the police into fold, it's either you listen or you don't listen, and then you use deadly force. I can understand Shaun, his position on the policing. Yes, there's been a lot of injustice by I guess the police department throughout the whole country. But I'm just saying in San Francisco, we're paving that way. And we're using also collaborative reform initiative, meaning that when the police does come to a situation where they have to use it upon a suspect, it's now called time, distance, and respond. And as you know, in the Tenderloin, there's many people that are on narcotics, and they have these problems that they're maybe on the drugs, and hopefully we can. In San Francisco, the shooting has gone down, officer shootings, and hopefully we can bring it under, I guess, to a 0 rating. So we're looking forward to that, but we got to keep our community safe as well. We can go on and on. I can tell you there's so many, there's community that says, hey, I'm not coming out, I'm getting attacked. So where's the fairness and where's the safety? So police has walked the beat in Chinatown. It has subsided, and the response is quicker. It's not that you have to call in and they come and there's nobody, the person's gone. We now have the beats officers on Chinatown. Just tell the, and if you do come to Chinatown, if you do commit crimes, they will arrest you.
Mm-hmm. We hear about when we talk about anti-Asian violence. It seems we hear disproportionately about, I'll use shorthand terms here, Black on Asian violence, which is not a majority, not a preponderance of the anti-Asian violence. It seems like we hear about it a lot. So Lavita, is that on us, the media? Is that something that we are guilty of, sort of playing up Black on Asian violence and playing down or making it seem as if that's the sort of preponderance of violence, when in fact it's not. Is that the case from your point of view, Lavita?
Well, I wish I could say that the role of media is to always give the complete and absolute truth, but we know that doesn't always happen. We know that fear makes the news, and fear sells stories. And so fear is what we see and what folks want to see it on the 5 o'clock news. The problem with that is when you perpetuate this idea that says that Black people are the ones who are attacking Asian people in America, that you continue to build upon this ideology that was based out of white supremacy, which is we're going to pit one race against another. We're going to make sure that these two communities who have had long histories of some tense situations between each other to continue to fight for scarce resources. And we're going to make sure that they understand that when they look at one another, that you're my enemy and I'm your enemy. So what that does is it only perpetuates that ongoing tense relationship between Black communities and Asian communities.
Yeah, and in Atlanta, a city with a big African American population and a lot of African American political and economic power. How is the leadership responding? How did the leadership respond, for example, to the anti-Asian violence that we saw? Was it with solidarity with the Asian American community, or otherwise?
So let's be very clear when we talk about the way our leadership has acted in Atlanta. I always tell people that Atlanta is not Georgia and Georgia is not Atlanta. And so, Atlanta might be this amazing city that has, all these different demographics in it and that folks think is very progressive. But then we have the rest of Georgia where we have a big issue with people who are in leadership who overlook and undervalue minority communities. And so we did not see a meaningful response from them in regards to anti-Asian hate until the tragic incident in March. And then it was a response to want to get out in front of what took place in Atlanta and try to push for stronger punishments and try to push for stronger legislation to prevent it from happening again. But that legislation didn't get to the root and the heart of the issue. For example, none of our elected officials have taken into consideration the fact that when you call 911 in Atlanta, you don't have language services that are going to provide the person calling who needs help in language resources or help. So if we can't get something as simple as that and making sure that it happens and it happens consistently, then I can't say that our leadership is doing a really good job at protecting the Asian community here.
I have what I think is a difficult question for Shaun, but it's kind of an open-ended question. So what can people do? What can Asian Americans do collectively in order to fight against this Asian American violence and to demand that it come to an end? We saw in the wake of the killing of George Floyd, we saw people across the country just sort of stand up for racial justice and go out into the streets in numbers that were impossible to ignore. Is it time for that sort of visible, assertive, popular movement on behalf of Asian Americans against the kind of violence that we've seen and in favor of racial justice? Shaun?
Thank you, Eugene. I wanted to speak quickly to the question that you asked Lavita first about the role of the media, and I would love to actually hear your thoughts on this too, as award-winning journalist and a member of the media.
Oh, sure.
But yes, I absolutely think that the media is responsible for the perception of this pandemic of anti-Asian violence. I think the media plays a amplifying role in kind of telling these stories. And I also think kind of what Lavita was saying earlier about the media not being a clear representation of what is actually happening on the ground. You know, the vast majority of violence and crimes and harms that happen in our communities are intraracial, meaning that they happen between people of the same racial group or the same ethnic group. But that's not as deemed as newsworthy as interracial violence. And those are the things that we see go viral, right? Or those are the things that we see circulated on social media all the time. So one, I want to be careful about how, I want to be like thoughtful about the role of the media in perpetrating these narratives. And then also say that these narratives have real tangible impacts. You know, the perception that there is a crisis of anti-Asian violence forces a response from police departments. You know, I know we're supposed to talk about like hate crime legislation. It forces a response from the judiciary in terms of longer prison sentences for people who are found to have committed these types of crimes. So, you know, the media is one thing that, you know, pushes particular narratives, but that there are real consequences that come out of this. And before I get to your question about what is to be done, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that too.
Yeah, no, I'm happy. I'm happy to take our share of responsibility as speaking for the media, because we perceive ourselves as at the Washington Post, at the Wall Street Journal, at the New York Times, at the San Francisco Chronicle. We make our independent decisions based on our news judgment. However, we have a certain sort of mindset because we've basically gone to the same schools and we've worked the same places and we've under the same editors, and we tend to think more alike than we admit to ourselves. And we tend to run in herds, and we tell ourselves that we don't and that we won't, but we do. And so I think it is true that we for whatever reason pay more attention to interracial violence than intraracial violence. And we shouldn't, but we do. But I'll put a big asterisk next to that in terms of taking responsibility, because more than half of the people in this country are getting their news not from us, not directly from us, but from Facebook and from social media, and that is that's an entire different. That's a whole discussion that we could spend hours on, because there are problems. I agree with information as it comes through the media, but that information, at least in responsible news organizations, has been vetted. It has been reported. It is basically true. It might be overemphasized, underemphasized, but it has been vetted to some standards. Whereas a lot of what people are reading on social media is misinformation. It's simply not true. And the crazier and more sort of provocative and incendiary the post on Facebook, the faster it spreads, and we know that that's the case. And so that's not to deflect media responsibility or to absolve us of the responsibility to do better, but it's just to say we are less than half the information and sensationalizing problem right now in the modern world, and we don't know what to do about that. We are all trying to grapple with that. I was on the Pulitzer Prize board for 9 years. We talked a lot about that. We talked a lot about how important it is to somehow deal with this question of misinformation and disinformation that's drowning out good information, and that fuels all kinds of conflict and violence in the society, as we saw on January 6th, as you know, which was fueled by primarily by social media. But Shaun, getting back, just don't want to let you complete your answer to the original question.
Yeah, thank you for sharing your thoughts on that. That was really helpful and grounding. You know, so thinking about like what's to be done, I'm thinking about the times that I've witnessed anti-Asian violence in my neighborhood. You know, a couple years ago, I was riding the bus here in Brooklyn and saw a woman yelling at an older Chinese woman on the bus, saying all sorts of horrible racist things to her. And I'm not even sure if the Chinese woman could understand really what was being said to her, but I'm sure that she could feel what the intentions were. And in that moment, I intervened by saying something and interrupting the exchange, and therefore made myself the target of this woman's anger and anti-Asian, you know, feelings or whatever. And, you know, the thing that really stuck with me about that particular exchange was the silence of everybody else on that bus, you know, and how isolating it feels when the people, you know, my neighbors, don't have my back in a moment like that, you know. And if I could go back and replay that situation, I would have centered less the woman who was yelling at the Chinese woman and centered more the Chinese woman herself, you know, in the middle of that exchange, to go and speak to her and see if she's okay, to see if she wants someone to move her out of that situation. Because I think, you know, I think where I differ from what Larry said about the feelings of safety is that I very much believe that safety needs to come from the bottom up as opposed to from the top down. And, you know, I encourage folks who maybe have similar experiences to, I think someone is mentioning something about bystander apathy. Yeah, there's trainings that folks can do to address these types of situations. What I've learned is honestly from a group called Brooklyn Movement Center here that was doing work around street harassment of women. And they offered a bunch of tips around how to engage when you see someone harassing a woman in the street that I feel like could be adapted to a lot of other instances of, you know, harassment or violence, in terms of just checking in with people, diffusing the situation, taking people out of the situation. And then the other thing is I'm reflecting on a conversation that I had with a friend at the Sikh Coalition, who was working with Sikh kids in Queens that were being bullied in the post 9/11 era. There was a particular instance where a kid was bullied into the bathroom, and you know, not Muslim, right, Sikh, but people don't know the difference, and so it's all the same. And had their head wrap taken off, their hair cut,
Wow.
and you know that they were talking about the restorative justice practices that they did. You know, so rather than really thinking about how to criminalize this child that did this, to understand that this comes from a place of ignorance. And you know, part of what came out of the instance was that the bully was asked to volunteer at a community organization to learn more about Sikh tradition, Sikh culture, Sikh beliefs, and that part of, you know, the actually addressing the harm that was caused is, you know, addressing the ignorance while also giving the space for people to grow from where they're at today. So I don't really have a large overarching, this is the answer, but I think that these small answers help to get us to the point.
Okay, it's time. We're now going to start asking our panelists questions that are being submitted. by the audience. Thanks for submitting the questions. We appreciate them, and they're good. And so I'm going to stick with Shaun just for the first question, and it's very direct. If police are not the solution, who should be enforcing the laws?
I think I'm thinking about like when harms are actually caused in our communities, like what the police do that make people think that the policing is actually addressing the particular harm, you know? So if you're saying that, okay, so let's say that we want to pass some hate crime legislation, right? So what that means, in fact, is like, it means that the legislator will commit more funding for the police department to hire more beat officers, to like enhance the police force. It means that judges will be asked to sentence people longer if they're found to be charged for hate crimes. But does that actually address the person who was harmed? Or does it actually address the actual root of the hate that is causing them to act in the way that they are? Upholding the law. I mean, I think that maybe a framework that feels like I'd rather, reframe this in is like, how do we look out for each other's safety, right? And I think that a lot of this comes from neighbors knowing neighbors, and people, Jane Jacobs wrote this book, The Life and Death of Great American Cities, and talks about eyes on the streets in terms of how do we create safety. And that's something that I very much believe in. I very much believe in, like elders working as conflict mediation folks, and, I think that when harms are perpetrated, so abolition isn't about a world of no consequences, but it's about a world in which we're not just saying that police and prisons are the answer to harms that are caused. I think that it's actually a lot of work to think through, how do we mend these harms? How do we mend relationships? How do we challenge people to really to reflect on their own personal biases, and how do we structurally think about what needs to change within our society at large?
Okay, thanks, Shaun. Lavita, a question for you. We saw the hate crime bill pass very quickly, and I don't want to get into your position on this or on that, but my question is there a role for Asian Americans to play in the larger struggle for racial justice, the larger question of racial justice, particularly for the African Americans, for Latinx Americans, and are Asian Americans visible enough in that struggle?
So I think that what we first have to do is stop perpetuating this false narrative and erasure of Black communities and Asian communities coming together and working in solidarity, like as if that has never happened before, because it has happened. It's been happening for decades. And the problem is that we don't amplify those stories and we don't amplify those victories. But in Georgia, what we were able to accomplish together is what flipped Georgia. What we were able to accomplish together is going to be what really takes Georgia beyond the anti-voting laws and beyond the really harsh laws that we see our leadership putting into place. And so I think that along the lines of what Shaun said, we have to really redefine and reimagine what accountability looks like. And we have to try to look beyond the American legal system that criminalizes Black and brown people while also saying it wants to heal and treat and provide Black and brown communities. It cannot do both, right? And so what our communities have to do is redefine the narrative that's been perpetuated, that we have to look at each other as enemies and realize that anti-Blackness is not the answer, and that white supremacy is never going to save us or you. And so we have to come together and work in solidarity and realize that we're better together than we are apart.
Larry, just to from your perch as a police commissioner, what can we do to make Asian Americans feel safer in San Francisco, to feel safer from the threat of violence. You mentioned that, for example, it sort of really increased after the in the Trump years, and maybe has sort of subsided a bit, but you know, there was an undercurrent there all along, and we've seen that it can erupt in really ugly ways. So what concretely can we do just to make people safer, to make people feel safer?
Thank you very much for asking me that question. But I just want to go back to Georgia. I want to thank Stacey Abrams for turning Georgia. If not, this country would have been, and for everybody all across the country, we'd be facing even more amped up hate than what it is. And then we wouldn't be even having this conversation. It would be so much hate going on there that it just drown us. And I also thank in Georgia, Bibi, for stepping up on the API side, turning that state around. So let's go forward. Regarding the hate that's out there, as I tried to say earlier, we all need to get over this fear, because the media sometimes perpetuate that it's nothing but violence out there. And so the seniors, the media, one after the other, shows the violence on there. It's been out there, but now we're living in real time media, which is you record it and boom, it's on the social media. And it looks like it's happening every day, everywhere. And sometimes they're replaying the old videos, and then you don't know whether this is the new violence that's been happening. I think there's a portion of the police that needs to be visible, where our community can communicate to them. And in San Francisco, Chinatown, we have Asian or Chinese speaking officers. It means the world to the community, because they can tell them and report if there's any violence. And then you can also point out where's the issues that are at hand. While as you didn't have, I guess, the monolingual, I mean, you know, you have these people that do not speak more than one language, or don't speak their native language. Trust is lost there. So we have to be trust, and then making sure that we're able to communicate our concerns. And with the support of the elected officials and the police department, we can come together as a community. I would say when you talk about addressing some of these people that are committing crimes, I agree with Shaun that restorative justice is a good thing to go forward on. But once you get a repeat offender, not one time, not two times, 5 times, 6 times, there has to be what you call a limit on how you, I guess, restore justice to that person. So there's also the point of when you say crimes happen and you can maybe reform the person. There's an incident in San Francisco, I'll just say real quickly. Person shot and killed somebody. DA says, well, I don't have enough evidence right now. He releases him less than 2 days before. Comes out, shoot 2 more people. Where's the justice in the 2 families that were lost? Those are some of the things that police have done. They have, you know, put away the criminal, and you can't release on these violent crimes. And there's some. You can talk about Atlanta shooting too as well. If the police did not intercede, he's already shot 7. He was going to Florida to kill more. I thank the police in Atlanta for stopping more violence in our community at that time. But again, we just got to weed out the ones that are the bad actors.
I'm gonna let me mention one thing. Just I've seen in the some of the comments have said this, that our discussion has seemed to be in terms of the political spectrum more on the Democratic side than on the Republican side. of the spectrum. I would just point out that that's simply reality. That is the reality of the Asian American electorate right now. It has become increasingly democratic, and in fact, until about the year 2000, it was actually for a time more Republican than Democratic, and now it is a very solid Democratic constituency, and increasingly powerful within the Democratic Party. And that is so that's where people are right now. Larry, let me just follow up with one final question, just about could you speak about how communities in San Francisco, in Oakland, how Asian American, Chinese American communities themselves are organizing or not to deal with what they perceive as a threat of violence?
In San Francisco, I guess we in the Asian community is also reaching out to our counterparts, the African Americans in the Bayville and their leadership, and sitting down, seeing where we can meet, where we need to address these issues, these I would say social and economic injustice, and how we can reduce the violence out there. It's not even on the Asian violence that's happening. It's also within their community as well, that there's such a rise in gun violence in San Francisco. It just went through the roof. But we need to address those issues, all issues throughout the whole community. Over in Oakland, I would say that community tried to organize as well to address those issues and bringing the community together. But they have to work with also the police department as well and elected officials to try to sit down and address the issue. You know, in Oakland Chinatown, it's only 3 to 4 blocks away from the Oakland Police Department. And, you know, that's, I'm not over there. I try to talk to some of those leaders over there, but I just want to take care of San Francisco, but I'll be happy to talk with the Oakland people as well. But we got some good elected officials that are trying to turn the San Francisco, or actually all California Police Department being transparent. And they have some bills, if you want to look at it, it's SB 1421. So.
Okay. Well, thanks so much. My notes say that unfortunately this is the end of our hour. We could speak for another couple of hours. I really want to thank our panelists. Thank you, Larry. Thank you, Lavita. Thank you, Shaun, for what I think has been a frank and I hope useful discussion, but only a beginning. This is a big subject, getting bigger. And I think one of the fascinating things that's happening, certainly in American politics, and one of the most important going forward, is the rise of Asian Americans to become a real, substantial, very important, and in many cases decisive factor in elections, not just in traditional places where you would expect, but in unlikely places like Georgia, and that is only going to increase as the Asian American population increases, as this becomes a more diverse, yet more diverse country. And it's going to be fascinating to see. My own personal view is that we are, as a nation, in for a bumpy ride as we become a majority minority country. But we'll get past it. We'll get through it, and let's hope that something better more peaceful for all of us lives on the other side. So with that, thank you again to the panelists, and I will turn it back to Margaret for closing remarks.
Yes, just the beginning, Eugene, and the beginning of a very bumpy ride. So thanks to you, Lavita, Shaun, and Larry. We appreciate your willingness and openness today and all of the work that you're doing. We're getting some great feedback in the comment box from our audience right now. So thanks to all of you. We're going to be continuing our task force work on this topic too. As a reminder, if you received an email to join our VIP reception, please click over to that second Zoom link right now. We're going to continue this conversation in an off the record and on camera format with all of our speakers. Thank you to our Asia Society team in New York, John Huang, Christine Shea, and Anping in Northern California, Rexel Uy, Angela Chung, James Gale, Michael Chung, and to everyone on our global task force. Thank you again to our speakers, and from all of us at the Asia Society, stay safe.